The gunshot echoed across the desert plain before Ryder Jameson even realized he had pulled the trigger, the rusted padlock exploding into fragments that scattered across the wooden wagon bed like deadly confetti. Inside the covered wagon, a woman with tangled auburn hair and eyes the color of storm clouds stared at him with a mixture of terror and disbelief, her wrists raw and bleeding from the iron shackles that had held her captive. He holstered his revolver and met her gaze with steady resolve, his voice cutting through the hot Idaho air like a blade through silk. "You're free." It was late August of 1878, and the sun beat down mercilessly on the trail between Shoshone and Twin Falls, turning the sagebrush-dotted landscape into a shimmering mirage of heat and dust. Ryder had been tracking the wagon for 2 days, ever since he had overheard 2 men bragging in a saloon about their merchandise they were transporting to sell across the territory. Human trafficking was a scourge that made his blood boil, a crime that reminded him too much of the darkest chapters of the nation's recent past. The Civil War had ended 13 years ago, but evil found new forms, new justifications, new victims. The woman did not move immediately. Her dress was torn and filthy, once a respectable blue calico now reduced to rags that barely covered her shoulders. Her feet were bare, and Ryder could see bruises mottling her arms and legs. She was young, perhaps 22 or 23, with delicate features that spoke of better days before whatever hell had brought her to this wagon. Her lips trembled as she tried to form words, but no sound emerged. "It's all right," Ryder said, his voice gentler now as he climbed into the wagon bed. The 2 men who had been driving were currently face down in the dirt 30 yards away, their hands bound with their own belts. He had gotten the drop on them while they were making camp, and they had surrendered without much fight when they realized they were outgunned and outmaneuvered. "I'm not going to hurt you. My name is Ryder Jameson. I'm taking you somewhere safe." The woman's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back fiercely. When she finally spoke, her voice was hoarse from disuse and dehydration. "They killed my family." The words came out flat, emotionless, as though she had repeated them so many times in her mind that they had lost all meaning. "Burned our homestead outside of Boise. Killed my parents and my younger brother. Took me because they said I would fetch a good price." Rage ignited in Ryder's chest, a white-hot fury that he forced himself to contain. Violence had already been done. What mattered now was justice and healing, in whatever form those could take. He reached for the shackles still binding her wrists, examining the mechanism. "These need a key," he said. "Or another bullet, but I'd rather not risk your hands. Let me check those bastards for the key." He jumped down from the wagon and stalked over to where the 2 men lay in the dirt. They were both in their 40s, weathered and mean-looking, with the kind of cold eyes that suggested they had committed worse crimes than kidnapping. Ryder searched their pockets roughly, finally finding a small iron key on a leather cord around the neck of the larger man. He yanked it free with enough force to make the man grunt in pain. "You're going to hang for this," Ryder told them conversationally. "I'm taking you both to the territorial marshal in Shoshone. He'll make sure you get a fair trial before they stretch your necks." "She ain't nothing," the smaller man spat. "Just another Irish whore whose family couldn't pay their debts." Ryder's boot connected with the man's ribs before he could stop himself, not hard enough to break anything but enough to make his point. "Shut your mouth, or I'll gag you with your own filthy bandana." He returned to the wagon where the woman waited, still frozen in place as though afraid that moving might shatter whatever fragile reality had granted her this reprieve. Ryder climbed back up and knelt beside her, holding up the key. "May I?" she nodded, extending her trembling hands. "Up close," Ryder could see that her eyes were actually hazel, shifting between green and brown depending on how the light caught them. Her hair, beneath the dirt and tangles, was a rich auburn that would probably shine like copper when clean. She had a scattering of freckles across her nose and cheeks, and despite the ordeal she had endured, there was something unbending in her gaze, a core of steel that refused to break. The shackles fell away with a click, and she immediately began rubbing her wrists, wincing at the pain. Ryder reached for his canteen and offered it to her. "Drink slowly," he advised. "You don't want to make yourself sick." She took the canteen with shaking hands and sipped carefully, her eyes never leaving his face. After a long moment, she lowered the canteen and said, "Thank you. I thought I was going to die in this wagon, or worse. I prayed someone would find me, but I had stopped believing anyone would." "What's your name?" Ryder asked. "Rose," she said. "Rose Harper. My family came from Ireland 10 years ago when I was 13. We were trying to make a life out here, but the land was hard and we borrowed money from the wrong people. When we couldn't pay, they came for everything we had, including me." Ryder's jaw tightened. The story was depressingly common in the territories, where law was scarce and predators were plentiful. "Rose Harper," he repeated, as though committing it to memory. "You're safe now, I promise you that." She studied him for a long moment, taking in his dust-covered clothing, the worn leather of his gun belt, the honest directness in his blue eyes. Ryder was 26, tall and lean from years of hard living, with dark hair that fell to his collar and a face that was more rugged than handsome. He had been a ranch hand, a scout, a deputy, and a dozen other things since coming west after the war. Right now, he was working as a freelance tracker, helping the territorial marshals hunt down criminals in exchange for bounties, and the satisfaction of making the frontier a little safer. "Why?" Rose asked suddenly. "Why did you come after us? You don't know me." "Because it was the right thing to do," Ryder said simply, "and because I couldn't live with myself if I let them take you wherever they were planning to sell you." Something shifted in Rose's expression, a crack in the armor she had built around herself. A single tear escaped and traced a clean line through the dirt on her cheek. "I don't have anywhere to go," she whispered. "Everything I had is gone." "One thing at a time," Ryder said. "First, we get you to Shoshone. There's a boarding house there run by a good woman named Mrs. Chen. She'll give you a room and help you get cleaned up. Then we'll figure out the rest." Rose nodded slowly, and Ryder could see her gathering herself, pulling together the scattered pieces of her courage. She was a survivor, that much was clear. Many people would have shattered completely after what she had been through, but Rose Harper was still fighting, still breathing, still hoping. Ryder helped her down from the wagon, noticing how unsteady she was on her feet after days of confinement. Without asking permission, he swept her up into his arms, ignoring her small gasp of surprise. "You're barefoot and exhausted," he said matter-of-factly. "No sense making you walk." He carried her to his horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding named Copper, and carefully lifted her into the saddle. Then he went back for the 2 prisoners, hauling them to their feet and tying them together with rope from the wagon. He would make them walk the 10 miles back to Shoshone. They deserved worse, but Ryder was not a cruel man, even to those who deserved cruelty. The journey back to town took the better part of the afternoon. Ryder led Copper by the reins, with Rose swaying slightly in the saddle but managing to stay upright. The 2 prisoners trudged along behind him, silent now, except for their labored breathing. The sun continued its merciless assault, and by the time the buildings of Shoshone came into view, everyone was coated in a fine layer of dust and sweat. Shoshone was a modest town of perhaps 500 souls, built along the railroad line that had brought prosperity and growth to southern Idaho. It had the usual collection of saloons, general stores, a hotel, a church, and a jail. The marshal's office was a squat adobe building near the center of town, and that was where Ryder headed first, still leading his strange procession. Marshal Tom Decker was sitting on the porch of his office, whittling a piece of wood and enjoying the shade, when Ryder arrived. Decker was in his 50s, a former cavalry officer who had settled in Idaho after retiring from the army. He had a salt and pepper beard and sharp eyes that missed nothing. Those eyes widened slightly when he saw Ryder, the prisoners, and the bedraggled young woman on the horse. "Jameson," Decker said, standing up and brushing wood shavings from his lap. "What have you brought me this time?" "Two slave traders," Ryder said flatly. "Caught them transporting this woman to sell her. They murdered her family and burned their homestead outside of Boise. I figure that's enough for a hanging if we can prove it." Decker's expression darkened as he looked at Rose, taking in her condition with a practiced eye. "Miss, is what he says true?" Rose nodded, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. "Every word. These men killed my parents and my brother. They took me from the ashes of my home and told me I was going to be sold to a brothel in Nevada. If Mr. Jameson had not found us, I would be there now, or dead." "Good enough for me," Decker said. He pulled out his revolver and gestured to the two prisoners. "Get in the cell. Try anything, and I'll shoot you where you stand." The two men shuffled into the office, and Ryder heard the clang of the cell door a moment later. Decker returned to the porch, holstering his weapon. "I'll send a wire to Boise, see if there's any record of a homestead fire. If her story checks out, and I have no doubt it will, these boys will hang within the month." "Good," Ryder said. He turned his attention back to Rose, who was watching the exchange with a kind of numb fascination. "Marshal, can you point us to Mrs. Chen's boarding house?" "Miss Harper needs a place to rest and recover. 2 blocks north, blue building with white trim," Decker said. "Tell Mrs. Chen I'll vouch for the lady's story. She'll take good care of her." Ryder tipped his hat in thanks and led Copper down the dusty street toward the boarding house. The few people who were out in the afternoon heat stared openly at the unusual sight, but Ryder ignored them. Small towns thrived on gossip, and he knew that by nightfall everyone in Shoshone would know about the rescue. That was fine. Let them talk. Rose had nothing to be ashamed of, and he would make that clear to anyone who suggested otherwise. Mrs. Chen's boarding house was exactly as described, a well-maintained 2-story building that stood out among the rougher structures around it. Mrs. Chen herself answered the door when Ryder knocked, a petite Chinese woman in her 40s with iron-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her expression was stern until she saw Rose, and then her face softened immediately. "Oh, you poor child," she said, her English accented but perfect. Come in, come in. You look like you have been through hell itself." Ryder helped Rose down from the horse, and Mrs. Chen took over with the efficiency of a field general, wrapping an arm around Rose's waist and guiding her inside. "I'll need a room for her," Ryder said. "Marshal Decker will vouch for her. I'll cover the first month's rent." Mrs. Chen waved a dismissive hand. "We will talk about money later. Right now, this girl needs a bath, a meal, and a bed. You, Cowboy, can come back tomorrow to check on her. She will be safe here." Ryder nodded, recognizing that he was being dismissed but grateful for it. Mrs. Chen was exactly the kind of person Rose needed right now, someone competent and caring who would not ask too many questions or demand too much too soon. He caught Rose's eye and said, "I'll be back tomorrow to see how you're doing. If you need anything before then, send word to the marshal's office. They'll know where to find me." Rose's eyes were enormous in her pale face. "Thank you," she said again, and this time there was a depth of feeling in the words that made Ryder's chest tighten. "I will never forget what you did for me today." "Just get some rest," Ryder said, and then he was backing out the door before the emotion in the room could overwhelm him. He spent that night in the saloon, nursing a whiskey and playing a few hands of poker with some of the locals. His mind kept drifting back to Rose Harper, to the scars on her wrists and the haunted look in her hazel eyes. He had rescued people before, it was part of the work he did, but something about Rose had gotten under his skin. Maybe it was her determination to stay strong despite everything she had endured. Maybe it was the way she had looked at him, as though he were some kind of hero instead of just a man doing what needed to be done. The next morning, Ryder found himself walking back to Mrs. Chen's boarding house earlier than he had intended. The sun was barely up, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, and the town was just beginning to stir. Mrs. Chen answered his knock with a knowing look in her dark eyes. "She is awake," Mrs. Chen said without preamble. "Having breakfast in the dining room. Go on in." Ryder found Rose sitting at a long wooden table, a plate of eggs and bacon in front of her. She had been transformed by a bath and clean clothing. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a simple braid, still damp at the ends, and she wore a modest green dress that Mrs. Chen must have provided. The bruises on her arms were more visible now, purple and yellow against her pale skin, but her face had regained some color. She looked up when Ryder entered, and a genuine smile crossed her face, the first he had seen from her. "Mr. Jameson," she said, "I was hoping you would come by." "Just Ryder," he said, pulling out a chair across from her. "How are you feeling?" "Better," Rose said. "Mrs. Chen drew me a bath last night and gave me some salve for my wrists. She even found me clothes that fit. I feel almost human again." Her smile faded slightly. "I still cannot quite believe it is real, that I am actually free." "It's real," Ryder assured her. "Those men are locked up and they will never hurt anyone again. You're safe here in Shoshone." Rose set down her fork and folded her hands in her lap. "I have been thinking," she said quietly, "about what happens now. I have no money, no family, no prospects. I cannot impose on Mrs. Chen's charity forever, and I have no idea how to begin rebuilding my life." Ryder had been thinking about the same thing. A woman alone in the territories had few options, most of them unpleasant. She could find work as a seamstress or a laundress if she was lucky, or she could end up in one of the brothels that she had so narrowly escaped. The thought of Rose facing either fate made something protective and fierce rise up in Ryder's chest. "You have time to figure it out," he said. "No one expects you to have all the answers right now. For what it is worth, Mrs. Chen mentioned last night that she could use help running the boarding house. She is not getting any younger and the work is hard. If you are interested, I could speak to her about hiring you." Hope flickered across Rose's face. "I could do that," she said. "I am a good cook, and I know how to clean and mend. My mother taught me everything she knew about keeping a home. If Mrs. Chen would be willing to give me a chance, I would work harder than anyone she has ever employed." "I'll talk to her," Ryder promised. "But Rose, I want you to understand something. You do not owe me anything. I did not rescue you so that you would be indebted to me. You are free in every sense of the word. Whatever choices you make from here on out, they should be because you want to make them, not because you feel obligated." Rose met his eyes, and Ryder saw that core of steel again, that unbreakable strength that had helped her survive. "I understand," she said softly. "And I appreciate that more than you know. But the truth is, I want to stay in Shoshone, at least for now. This is the first place in a long time where I have felt safe. And you," she hesitated, a faint blush coloring her cheeks, "you are the reason I am alive. I would like to get to know you better if you do not mind." Something warm unfurled in Ryder's chest, a feeling he had not experienced in years. "I would like that too," he admitted. Over the following weeks, a routine developed. Ryder, who had been planning to move on to another job, found himself staying in Shoshone longer than he had intended. Mrs. Chen had indeed hired Rose to help with the boarding house, and Rose threw herself into the work with a dedication that impressed everyone who met her. She cooked, cleaned, did laundry, and managed the accounts with a sharp mind for numbers that Mrs. Chen appreciated. In the evenings, when the work was done, Ryder would often stop by, and he and Rose would sit on the porch of the boarding house, talking as the sun set over the desert. They talked about everything. Rose told him about her childhood in Ireland, about the poverty and hunger that had driven her family to emigrate. She spoke of her parents with love and grief, and of her younger brother Tommy, who had been only 15 when he died. She cried sometimes when she talked about them, and Ryder would sit quietly, letting her have her grief without trying to fix it or rush her through it. Ryder told her about his own past, about growing up in Missouri and fighting in the war when he was barely old enough to hold a rifle. He had seen things during those years that still haunted his dreams, and he had come west afterward seeking a kind of redemption, or perhaps just escape. He did not talk much about the violence he had witnessed and participated in, but Rose seemed to understand the shadows that lived behind his eyes. "We are both survivors," she said one evening as they watched the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky. "We have both lost people we loved and seen things we wish we could forget, but we are still here, still fighting. That has to count for something." "It does," Ryder agreed. He reached over and took her hand, gently, giving her every chance to pull away if she wanted. She did not. Instead, she laced her fingers through his and held on as though he were an anchor in a storm. The trial of the two men who had kidnapped Rose took place in mid-September. The territorial judge rode in from Boise specifically for the case, and the courtroom was packed with curious onlookers. Rose testified with calm dignity, recounting the night her home had burned and the terrible days that followed. Her testimony was corroborated by a marshal from Boise who had investigated the fire and found the bodies of her family in the ruins. The defense attorney, a young man who looked deeply uncomfortable with his clients, made only a perfunctory effort to defend them. The jury deliberated for less than an hour before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. The two men were hanged the next morning. Ryder attended the execution, standing at the back of the crowd with his arms folded across his chest. Rose had chosen not to come, and Ryder respected that decision. Justice had been served, but he knew that watching the men die would not bring back her family or erase the trauma they had inflicted. After the hanging, Ryder walked back to the boarding house and found Rose in the kitchen, kneading bread dough with fierce concentration. She looked up when he entered, her hands coated in flour. "Is it done?" she asked. "It's done," Ryder confirmed. Rose nodded slowly, then went back to kneading the dough. "I thought I would feel something," she said after a moment. "Relief or satisfaction or closure, but I just feel empty. They are dead, but my family is still dead too. Nothing has really changed." Ryder moved closer, leaning against the kitchen counter. "Grief does not work on a schedule," he said. "You will carry this loss for the rest of your life, but it will get easier to bear bit by bit. And you will build a new life, one that honors the memory of the people you loved." Rose set the dough aside and wiped her hands on her apron. Then, to Ryder's surprise, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him, pressing her face against his chest. He could feel her trembling, and he held her carefully as though she were something precious and fragile. "Thank you," she whispered into his shirt, "for everything, for saving me, for staying, for being here." Ryder rested his chin on top of her head, breathing in the scent of her hair soap and bread dough and something indefinably Rose. "I am not going anywhere," he said, and meant it with a certainty that surprised him. Autumn came to southern Idaho, bringing cooler temperatures and the first hints of frost in the mornings. Ryder took on some work with a local rancher, helping to round up cattle and prepare for winter. It was honest labor that paid decently and kept him in Shoshone, which was all he wanted. He rented a room at Mrs. Chen's boarding house, which gave him an excuse to see Rose every day. Their relationship deepened slowly, carefully, like two people learning to trust after being hurt. They went on walks together through the sagebrush hills outside town, and Ryder taught Rose to ride his horse copper, laughing as she clutched the saddle horn with white-knuckled determination. They attended church on Sundays, sitting together in the back pew, and Ryder noticed how the other townspeople gradually accepted Rose as one of their own rather than as a victim or an outsider. One evening in late October, as they sat on the porch wrapped in blankets against the chill, Rose said, "I think I am falling in love with you." The words hung in the air between them, brave and vulnerable. Ryder turned to look at her, seeing the uncertainty in her eyes and the courage it must have taken to speak her feelings aloud. He reached up and cupped her face in his hand, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone. "I know I am falling in love with you," he said. "I think I have been since the day I found you in that wagon." Rose's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "I was so broken that day. I did not think I would ever feel whole again, but you make me feel like I can be more than just what happened to me. You make me feel like I have a future." "You do have a future," Ryder said fiercely. "A bright one. And if you will let me, I would like to be part of it." In answer, Rose leaned forward and kissed him. It was soft and tentative at first, a question rather than a statement. But when Ryder kissed her back, deepening the connection, it became something more: a promise, a commitment, a declaration of everything they had found in each other. The winter of 1878 was harsh, with snow piling up in the streets of Shoshone and temperatures dropping below zero for weeks at a time. Ryder spent his days chopping wood and making repairs around the boarding house, while Rose kept the kitchen warm and fragrant with baking. They would sit by the fire in the evenings, sometimes reading aloud to each other from Mrs. Chen's small collection of books, sometimes just talking quietly about their dreams for the future. Ryder had been thinking about those dreams a lot lately. He had spent most of his adult life drifting from place to place, never putting down roots or planning more than a few months ahead. But Rose had changed something fundamental in him. She made him want stability, permanence, a home. He wanted to build something with her, something that would last. On Christmas Eve, with snow falling gently outside and the boarding house decorated with pine boughs and candles, Ryder asked Rose to marry him. He did not have a ring to offer her. Money was still tight, and he was saving for other things, but he had a simple silver locket that had belonged to his mother. He presented it to Rose after dinner, when they were alone in the parlor, and went down on one knee in the traditional manner. "Rose Harper," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "you are the bravest, strongest, most beautiful woman I have ever known. You have survived things that would have destroyed most people, and you have done it with grace and dignity and an open heart. I love you more than I have ever loved anyone or anything. Will you marry me?" Rose stared at him, tears streaming down her face, and for a heart-stopping moment, Ryder thought she might say no. But then she was nodding vigorously, her hands pressed to her mouth as though to hold in a sob. "Yes," she managed to say. "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes." Ryder slipped the locket around her neck and then pulled her into his arms, kissing her with all the love and longing he had been holding back. Rose kissed him back just as fiercely, her fingers tangling in his hair, and when they finally pulled apart, they were both breathless and laughing. "I never thought I would be this happy again," Rose whispered. "After everything that happened, I thought happiness was something that belonged to other people, but you showed me that I could have it too, that I deserved it." "You do deserve it," Ryder said. "You deserve everything good this world has to offer." They were married in February of 1879, in the small church in Shoshone, with Marshall Decker standing up as Ryder's best man and Mrs. Chen serving as Rose's matron of honor. It was a simple ceremony, attended by most of the town, and Rose wore a white dress that she and Mrs. Chen had sewn together from fabric Ryder had bought at the general store. She looked radiant, her auburn hair crowned with winter wildflowers, and when she smiled at Ryder across the altar, he felt like the luckiest man alive. After the wedding, they moved into a small house on the outskirts of town that Ryder had been fixing up in secret for months. It was not much, just 3 rooms and a porch, but it was theirs, and Rose cried when she saw it, overwhelmed by the realization that she had a home again, a place that belonged to her and could not be taken away. They settled into married life with an ease that surprised them both. Ryder took a job as a deputy marshal, working under Tom Decker to keep the peace in Shoshone and the surrounding territory. The work was dangerous at times, but it paid well and gave Ryder a sense of purpose beyond mere survival. Rose continued working at the boarding house for a while, but eventually she and Ryder decided that she would focus on their home and garden instead. She proved to have a remarkable talent for growing things, and by summer, their little plot was bursting with vegetables and herbs. In the evenings, they would sit on their porch and watch the sun set over the desert, talking about their day and making plans for the future. They talked about children, about how many they wanted and what they would name them. Rose wanted a big family, enough children to fill their house with noise and laughter and love. Ryder wanted whatever made Rose happy, but he admitted that he liked the idea of a son to teach to ride and shoot, or a daughter to spoil and protect. Life was not always easy. There were hard days when Rose would wake from nightmares about the fire and the men who had taken her, and Ryder would hold her in the darkness until the fear passed. There were times when Ryder came home from a particularly difficult job, exhausted and troubled, and Rose would sit with him in silence, offering her presence as comfort. But through it all, they had each other, and that was enough. In the spring of 1880, Rose discovered she was pregnant. The news filled them both with a joy so intense it was almost painful. Ryder became absurdly protective, insisting that Rose rest more and let him take over the heavier chores around the house. Rose tolerated his fussing with good humor, even as she continued her gardening and cooking, and all the other tasks that made their home run smoothly. Their daughter was born in November of 1880, a healthy baby with wisps of auburn hair and her mother's hazel eyes. They named her Emma Grace, after Ryder's mother and Rose's grandmother. Holding his daughter for the first time, feeling her tiny weight in his arms and seeing the absolute trust in her unfocused gaze, Ryder felt a shift in his world. Everything he had been, the soldier, the drifter, the tracker, became secondary to this new role: father. Rose was a natural mother, patient and loving and endlessly capable. She nursed Emma and sang to her in Irish old songs from her childhood that Rose had thought she had forgotten. Ryder would often find them together in the rocking chair by the window, Rose humming softly while Emma dozed against her chest, and the sight would fill him with such contentment that he could barely stand it. The years that followed were the happiest of Ryder's life. He watched Emma grow from an infant to a toddler to a bright, curious little girl with her mother's smile and her father's stubbornness. In 1882, Rose gave birth to their second child, a son they named Thomas Ryan, after Rose's brother and Ryder's grandfather. Tommy, as they called him, was a robust baby with lungs that could wake the whole house, and a sunny disposition that made everyone who met him smile. Their family complete, Ryder and Rose threw themselves into building a life that would give their children everything they had lacked in their own difficult pasts. Ryder eventually left his job as deputy marshal and used his savings to buy a small ranch outside of Shoshone. It was only 40 acres, but it was enough to run some cattle and horses, and it gave the children room to run and explore. Rose proved to be as capable a ranch wife as she had been at everything else. She managed their household with cheerful efficiency, teaching Emma to cook, and so while also instilling in her daughter a fierce independence and sense of self-worth. Tommy followed his father everywhere, a small shadow in a too large hat, learning to ride and rope and care for the animals. In the evenings, when the children were asleep and the ranch was quiet, Ryder and Rose would sit together on their porch, much as they had done when they were courting. Sometimes they would talk, sometimes they would simply hold hands and watch the stars. The violence and loss that had brought them together felt like ancient history now, scars that had healed into something bearable. "You ever think about how we met?" Rose asked one night in the summer of 1884. Emma was 5 years old and Tommy was 2, both sleeping soundly inside the house. The air was warm and filled with the sound of crickets, and the moon hung low and golden over the desert. "Sometimes," Ryder admitted, "I think about how close I came to not being there that day. If I had left that saloon 5 minutes earlier, or if I had decided not to bother tracking those men, you would have been lost. It terrifies me to think about." "But you were there," Rose said softly. "You found me when I needed you most. You shot that lock and set me free, and in doing so, you gave me back my life. More than that, you gave me a life I never could have imagined, a husband I love, children I adore, a home where I feel safe and valued. You gave me everything." Ryder brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles. "You gave me just as much," he said. "Before I met you, I was just drifting. I had no purpose, no real happiness. You made me want to be better, to build something that would last. You made me whole." Rose leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat that way for a long time, wrapped in the peace they had created together. In the distance, a coyote called, a lonely sound that was answered by another. But inside their small ranch house, their children slept safely, and on the porch, 2 people who had been broken by violence and loss held each other and counted their blessings. As the years passed, Ryder and Rose's ranch grew and prospered. They added more land, more cattle, and eventually built a larger house to accommodate their growing family. In 1886, Rose gave birth to their 3rd child, another daughter they named Sarah Marie. Sarah had her father's dark hair and blue eyes, and from the moment she could walk, she was climbing trees and getting into mischief that would have given her mother heart palpitations if Rose had not been so busy laughing. Emma grew into a thoughtful, intelligent girl who loved reading and learning. Ryder and Rose sent her to the school that had been established in Shoshone, and she excelled at her studies, much to the teacher's delight. Tommy was more interested in the physical world around him, happiest when he was outdoors working with the animals or helping his father mend fences and break horses. By 1888, the ranch employed 3 hired hands, and Ryder had gained a reputation as one of the most successful ranchers in the territory. He was known for his fairness, his hard work, and his devotion to his family. People respected him, and those who remembered the story of how he had rescued Rose from the slave traders spoke of him with admiration. Rose, for her part, had become a pillar of the community. She was involved in the church, helped organize charitable drives for families in need, and was known for her kindness and generosity. The boarding house where she had once worked had closed after Mrs. Chen passed away in 1885, but Rose had ensured that the older woman's final years were comfortable, visiting her regularly and caring for her when illness struck. The shadow of Rose's trauma never entirely disappeared, but it had faded to something manageable, a distant ache rather than a constant pain. She still had nightmares occasionally, and there were certain things, the smell of smoke, the sound of men shouting, that could trigger a moment of panic. But Ryder was always there to steady her, to remind her that she was safe and loved, and that nothing bad was going to happen to her or their children. In 1890, when Emma turned 10, she asked her mother about the scar around her wrists. Rose had always worn long sleeves or bracelets to hide the marks left by the shackles, but Emma was observant and had noticed. Rather than deflect or lie, Rose sat her daughter down and told her the truth, not all the details, but enough to help Emma understand the importance of courage and resilience, and the power of one person to change another's life. "Your father saved me," Rose told Emma, holding her daughter's hands. "He could have ridden past that wagon and never looked back, but he chose to help someone he did not even know. That choice changed everything for me, and for you and your brothers and sister. It gave us this life. Never forget that one act of kindness, one moment of bravery, can ripple out and change the world." Emma absorbed the story with the seriousness of a child who understood she was being trusted with something important. "I want to be brave like that," she said. "I want to help people." "You will," Rose assured her. "You already do, just by being kind and thoughtful. The world needs more people like you, Emma." The conversation stayed with Emma, shaping the woman she would eventually become. Years later, she would become a teacher herself, dedicated to educating the children of ranchers and miners and homesteaders, giving them the tools they needed to build better lives. But that was in the future, still unwritten. In the summer of 1890. That summer was particularly memorable for the Jameson family. Ryder and Rose decided to take their children on a trip to Boise, partly for business. Ryder needed to buy breeding stock, and partly to show the children the wider world beyond their ranch in Shoshone. It was an adventure that delighted Tommy and Sarah, who had never been farther than the neighboring town of Twin Falls in Boise. They stayed at a hotel that seemed impossibly grand to the children, with carpeted floors and indoor plumbing. They visited shops and restaurants, attended a theatrical performance, and even had their photograph taken at a proper studio. The photograph captured them as they were: Ryder tall and weathered but smiling, Rose beautiful in a new dress, and their 3 children arrayed around them with expressions ranging from solemn to mischievous. On their last day in Boise, Rose asked Ryder to take her to the site where her family's homestead had been. It had been 12 years since the fire, and she had never been back. Ryder was not sure it was a good idea, but Rose insisted, and so they borrowed a wagon and drove out to the place where she had grown up. There was nothing left of the Harper homestead now except a few charred timbers and the remnants of a foundation, all of it overgrown with weeds and wildflowers. Rose stood in the middle of the ruins for a long time, her hand pressed to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Ryder stayed close but gave her space to grieve, knowing that this was something she needed to do. Finally, Rose turned to him, her face red and blotchy but somehow peaceful. "I needed to see it," she said. "I needed to remember where I came from, even though it hurt. This place was full of love once, even if it ended in tragedy. My parents would be happy to know that I survived, that I found you, that I gave their grandchildren the life they wanted for me." "They would be proud of you," Ryder said. "Just as I am." Rose nodded and took one last look around. Then she turned her back on the ruins and walked toward the wagon where their children waited. "Let's go home," she said, and Ryder knew she meant the ranch, the life they had built together, the future that stretched out before them like the wide Idaho sky. The 1890s brought both challenges and joys. A drought in 1891 tested their resources and forced Ryder to sell off some cattle to keep the ranch afloat. A harsh winter the following year killed more livestock and left the family struggling to make ends meet. But they weathered these storms together, drawing on the same resilience and determination that had brought them through earlier hardships. In 1893, when Emma was 13, she began helping her father with the ranch accounts, showing an aptitude for mathematics and business that impressed Ryder. Tommy, at 11, was already a skilled horseman, and Ryder began teaching him the finer points of training and breeding. Sarah, at 7, was the family's wild card, charming and impulsive, equally likely to bring home an injured rabbit to nurse, or to convince her siblings to play elaborate pranks on the hired hands. Rose continued to be the steady heart of the family, managing the household and mediating the inevitable conflicts that arose between siblings. She taught her daughters to be strong and independent, making sure they knew that they had value beyond their ability to cook and clean. She taught Tommy to respect women and to understand that true strength came from protecting those weaker rather than dominating them. In 1895, tragedy struck when a neighboring ranch was attacked by a group of outlaws. The rancher and his wife were killed, and their 2 children were orphaned. Ryder was part of the posse that tracked down the outlaws, and the experience shook him badly, reminding him of the violence he had spent years trying to leave behind. He came home from that grim business exhausted and troubled, and Rose held him through the night as he struggled with memories of war and death. "I thought I was done with killing," he said quietly. "I thought I had left that life behind." "You did what had to be done to protect others," Rose said firmly. "Those men made their choice when they decided to murder innocent people. You gave them justice, not revenge. There is a difference." Ryder was not entirely convinced, but Rose's words helped. He redoubled his efforts to focus on the life-affirming work of the ranch, on raising his children to be good people, on building something positive in a world that often seemed determined to tear things down. As the century drew to a close, the Jameson family looked toward the future with hope and optimism. Emma, now 19, had become a teacher at the Shoshone school, living her dream of educating the next generation. She had also attracted the attention of a young lawyer in town, and Ryder and Rose watched with amusement and a touch of sadness as their eldest daughter navigated her first serious romance. Tommy, at 17, was already as tall as his father and twice as stubborn. He had his own ideas about how the ranch should be run, and he and Ryder clashed occasionally over methods and priorities. But beneath the arguments was a deep mutual respect, and Ryder knew that, when the time came to hand over the ranch, Tommy would be more than capable of running it. Sarah, at 13, was still finding her way. She had her mother's compassionate heart and her father's stubborn streak, a combination that sometimes led to trouble but more often led to unexpected moments of grace. She volunteered at the church, helping with the Sunday school and organizing donation drives, and Rose suspected that Sarah might have a calling to some form of service work. On New Year's Eve of 1899, the entire Jameson family gathered on their porch to watch the fireworks that the town of Shoshone had organized to celebrate the turn of the century. It was a cold, clear night, and the stars seemed close enough to touch. As the first fireworks exploded overhead, painting the sky in brilliant colors. Ryder pulled Rose close and kissed her temple. 21 years, he murmured. Can you believe it has been 21 years since I found you in that wagon? It feels like a lifetime and like yesterday all at once, Rose said. Everything good in my life came from that moment. You, our children, this ranch, this life. I would not change a single thing. Even the hard parts, Ryder asked. Even the hard parts, Rose confirmed. Because they led me here to you, to this. I was so broken when you found me, Ryder. I thought I would never be whole again. But you put me back together, piece by piece, with your patience and your love. You showed me that even after the worst has happened, there can still be joy and beauty and hope. Ryder tightened his arms around her, overcome by emotion. Around them, their children laughed and pointed at the fireworks, their faces alight with wonder. This was his legacy. Ryder thought not the cattle or the land or the money he had accumulated, but these people, this family, this love that would outlast him and ripple out into generations yet unborn. The new century brought new opportunities and challenges. In 1901, Emma married her lawyer, a good man named Daniel Webster who treated her with respect and adoration. The wedding was a grand affair by Shoshone standards, held at the ranch with half the town in attendance. Rose cried through the entire ceremony, overcome by the bittersweet reality of watching her daughter start a new chapter of her life. Tommy took over more responsibilities on the ranch as Ryder began to slow down. At 49, Ryder was still strong and capable, but the years of hard work had taken their toll. His joints ached in cold weather, and he found he needed more rest than he used to. He was content to let Tommy take the lead, stepping in only when his experience was needed. Sarah announced in 1902 that she wanted to become a nurse, inspired by a visiting doctor who had spoken at the church about the need for medical care in rural communities. Ryder and Rose supported her ambition wholeheartedly, and they began making plans to send her to a nursing school in Boise. In 1903, Emma gave birth to Ryder and Rose's first grandchild, a boy named after his grandfather. Holding little Ryder in his arms, the elder Ryder felt the circle of life close in a way that was both humbling and awe-inspiring. He was a grandfather now, a patriarch, and the thought filled him with a sense of purpose that went beyond his own existence. Rose was a doting grandmother, visiting Emma and the baby as often as she could and showering her grandson with attention and gifts. Watching her with the baby, Ryder was struck anew by her capacity for love, by the way she had taken the broken pieces of her past and transformed them into something beautiful and life-affirming. In the summer of 1905, Rose and Ryder celebrated their 26th wedding anniversary with a quiet dinner on their porch, just the two of them. The children were all occupied with their own lives, Emma with her family, Tommy with the ranch, Sarah away at nursing school, and for once, the house was peaceful. "I have been thinking," Rose said as they watched the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, "about how far we have come. Sometimes it feels like that day you found me was a different lifetime, something that happened to someone else. But then I remember the feeling of those shackles, the fear, the hopelessness, and I realize how lucky I am, how lucky we are." "Luck had nothing to do with it," Ryder said. "We built this life together through hard work and determination and love. We earned every bit of happiness we have." "Perhaps," Rose said thoughtfully, "but I still think of you as my miracle, Ryder Jameson. The cowboy who shot the lock and said I was free. You gave me more than just my physical freedom that day. You gave me hope and purpose and a reason to keep fighting. You gave me love, and that has made all the difference." Ryder reached across the table and took her hand, marveling at the fact that after all these years, The sight of her still made his heart beat faster. There was gray in her auburn hair now, and lines around her eyes from years of laughter and worry. But she was as beautiful to him as she had been that first day, maybe more so because now he knew the depth of her strength and the vastness of her heart. "You are my miracle too," he said. "Before you, I was just going through the motions, surviving but not really living. You taught me what it means to truly love someone, to build a life with purpose and meaning. Everything good that I am because of you." They sat together as the stars came out, two people who had found each other in the worst of circumstances and created something extraordinary. Around them, the ranch hummed with live cattle lowing in the distance, horses moving in the corral, crickets beginning their nightly chorus. It was a symphony of home, of belonging, of everything they had fought for and won. In the years that followed, Ryder and Rose watched their legacy grow and flourish. Emma had 3 more children, all healthy and bright. Tommy married a kind young woman from Twin Falls in 1906, and they soon started a family of their own. Sarah graduated from nursing school and took a position at the boys' hospital, where she quickly gained a reputation for her skill and compassion. The ranch continued to prosper under Tommy's management, expanding its operations and becoming one of the most successful in southern Idaho. Ryder officially retired in 1908, content to spend his days working in the garden with Rose, playing with his grandchildren, and watching the sunset from his porch. In the spring of 1910, Rose and Ryder returned to Mrs. Chen's old boarding house, which had been converted into a community center. The town had decided to place a plaque honoring Mrs. Chen's contributions to Shoshone, and they asked Rose to say a few words at the dedication. Standing before a crowd of neighbors and friends, Rose spoke movingly about the Chinese woman who had taken in a terrified, traumatized girl and given her a place to heal. "Mrs. Chen taught me that family is not always about blood," Rose said, her voice strong and clear. "It is about the people who show up when you need them most, who offer kindness without expecting anything in return. She was family to me, just as all of you have become family over the years. This town gave me a second chance at life, and I will be forever grateful." As they walked home from the ceremony, Ryder wrapped his arm around Rose's waist. "That was beautiful," he said. "Mrs. Chen would have been proud." "I hope so," Rose said. "I owe her so much, just as I owe you everything." "We owe each other," Ryder corrected. "That is how love works." By 1912, Ryder was 60 years old and slowing down considerably. His hands shook sometimes, and he had trouble with his hearing. But his mind was still sharp, and his love for Rose and their family had not diminished one bit. They spent their days in comfortable companionship, reading together, tending their garden, and receiving visits from their ever-growing brood of grandchildren. One afternoon in late summer, as they sat on their porch watching a thunderstorm roll across the desert, Rose said, "Do you have any regrets, Ryder?" Ryder thought about the question carefully. There were things in his past he was not proud of, mistakes he had made, people he had hurt. But when he looked at his life as a whole, at the woman beside him and the family they had created, he found that he could not regret the path that had led him here. "No," he said finally, "I do not have regrets. How could I, when everything I did, every choice I made, brought me to you?" Rose smiled, that same smile that had first captured his heart 34 years ago. "Good," she said, "because I do not have any regrets either, not a single one." They held hands as the thunder rumbled and the rain began to fall, washing the dust from the world and leaving everything fresh and clean. In that moment, Ryder felt at peace in a way he had never quite achieved before. He had done what he set out to do. He had built a good life, raised good children, and loved a woman with all his heart. What more could any man ask for? The years continued to pass, each one bringing its own mix of joys and sorrows. In 1915, the world was plunged into war, though America remained neutral for the time being. Ryder and Rose watched the news with concern, remembering their own experiences with conflict and praying that their grandchildren would never have to know the horrors of war. Tommy's oldest son, young Ryder, turned 17 in 1916 and announced his intention to join the Army if America entered the war. The news terrified Rose, who saw too much of her own father and brother in the boy's eager patriotism. But she also recognized that he was his own person, capable of making his own choices, and she supported him even as her heart broke at the thought of him in danger. Ryder the elder took his grandson aside one evening and spoke to him man to man about the realities of war, about the things he would see and do that would change him forever. "If you go for the right reasons," Ryder said. "You go to protect others, not for glory or adventure. And you remember that every life you take, even in war, leaves a mark on your soul. You have to be willing to carry that weight." Young Ryder listened seriously, and though he did not change his mind about enlisting, Ryder could see that the conversation had given him pause, had made him think more deeply about what he was committing to. That was all a grandfather could ask for, to pass on his hard-won wisdom and trust that it would be used well. In 1917, America entered the war, and young Ryder enlisted as he had promised. The family gathered to see him off at the train station, and Rose clung to her grandson with tears streaming down her face. "Come home to us," she whispered. "Promise me you will come home." "I promise, Grandma," the young man said, and Ryder prayed that it was a promise he could keep. The war years were difficult for the family, marked by worry and waiting and the constant fear that a telegram would arrive with terrible news. But young Ryder survived, returning home in 1919 with medals and scars and a 1,000-yard stare that gradually faded as he reintegrated into ranch life. He was forever changed by his experiences, but he was alive, and that was what mattered. By 1920, Ryder and Rose were both in their late 60s and enjoying the relative peace of their twilight years. They had 14 grandchildren now, ranging in age from infants to young adults, and the house was rarely quiet when they all came to visit. Rose loved the chaos, thriving on the noise and laughter and constant activity. Ryder was content to sit in his rocking chair and watch it all unfold, marveling at the dynasty they had created from nothing but love and determination. One evening, as they prepared for bed, Rose suddenly turned to Ryder with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said. Ryder was confused. "For what?" "For choosing to care," Rose said. "That day on the trail when you heard those men talking about their captive, you could have decided it was not your problem. You could have ridden away and never looked back. But you chose to care about a stranger, to risk your own safety to help someone you did not know. That choice saved my life and created all of this." She gestured around them, encompassing not just their bedroom but their entire life together. "So thank you, Ryder Jameson. Thank you for being the kind of man who shoots the lock and says you're free." Ryder pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. "I would do it all again," he said hoarsely. "Every single moment. Finding you was the best thing that ever happened to me." They held each other for a long time, two survivors who had found love in the ashes of trauma and built something beautiful and lasting. Outside, the Idaho night was clear and calm, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. But inside their small bedroom, wrapped in each other's arms, Ryder and Rose were home. The 1920s brought modernity to Idaho in ways that would have seemed like science fiction to the young couple who had met in 1878. Automobiles became common. Electricity reached even rural areas like their ranch, and the radio brought news and entertainment from across the country. Ryder and Rose adapted to these changes with varying degrees of enthusiasm, though they both agreed that some of the old ways were better. In 1923, they celebrated their 44th wedding anniversary with a party that brought together nearly 100 family members and friends. Looking around at the gathering at their children and grandchildren, and the community they had helped build, Ryder felt a profound sense of accomplishment. This was his legacy, he thought. Not wealth or fame, but love multiplied and passed down through generations. Rose gave a toast that evening, her voice still strong despite her 70 years. 44 years ago, I married my hero, she said. The man who saved my life and then spent every day since making it worth living. We have built a beautiful life together, filled with love and laughter and, yes, some tears. But through it all, we have had each other, and that has made every hardship bearable and every joy sweeter. To many more years, my love. To many more years, the assembled crowd echoed, raising their glasses. Ryder and Rose had 6 more years together. They were good years, peaceful years, filled with the simple pleasures of long marriage and shared memories. They took walks around the ranch, greeted each sunrise from their porch, and spent their evenings reading or talking or simply sitting in companionable silence. Their children and grandchildren visited regularly, and the house was rarely empty. In the spring of 1929, Rose became ill with pneumonia. Despite the best efforts of Sarah, who had come home to nurse her mother, Rose did not recover. She died peacefully in her sleep on a warm May morning, with Ryder holding her hand and their children gathered around her bed. She was 72 years old, and she had lived a full, rich life. Ryder was devastated by her loss. For 50 years, Rose had been his partner, his love, his reason for getting up in the morning. Without her, the world seemed colorless and empty. He went through the motions of living, attending her funeral, accepting condolences from the community, trying to be strong for his children, but inside, he felt hollowed out. In the weeks after Rose's death, Ryder spent long hours on the porch they had shared, remembering. He remembered the first time he saw her, chained and terrified in the back of that wagon. He remembered the sound of the gunshot as he freed her, and the look of disbelief and hope in her eyes. He remembered their wedding day, the birth of their children, 1,000 small moments that had woven together to create a life. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of gold and crimson, Ryder felt Rose's presence so strongly that he almost turned around expecting to see her. Instead, he heard her voice in his memory as clearly as if she were sitting beside him. We built this life together through hard work and determination and love. We earned every bit of happiness we have. Ryder smiled through his tears. She was right, of course. They had earned their happiness, and nothing, not even death, could take away what they had shared. Rose would always be with him, in his heart, and in the legacy they had created together. Ryder lived for 3 more years after Rose's passing, surrounded by the family they had built and sustained by memories of their love. He died in his sleep in October of 1932, at the age of 80. His children found him on the porch, his rocking chair still moving slightly, a peaceful expression on his weathered face. In his hand was the silver locket he had given Rose so many years ago, the one she had worn every day of their married life and had asked to be buried with. Somehow, Ryder had retrieved it from her grave, or perhaps one of the children had given it to him as a keepsake. Either way, he had died holding this tangible symbol of their love. Ryder was buried beside Rose in the Shoshone Cemetery, under a simple headstone that read, Ryder Jameson, 1852-1932. Beloved husband, father, and grandfather, He chose to care. The ranch passed to Tommy, who ran it successfully for another 40 years before handing it down to his own children. Emma's descendants became teachers and lawyers, carrying on her legacy of education and justice. Sarah's children and grandchildren went into medicine and nursing, healing the sick and comforting the suffering. But the story that was told and retold through the generations, the one that defined the Jameson family more than any other, was the story of how Ryder found Rose chained in the back of a wagon, shot the lock, and said, "You're free." It became a family legend, a reminder of the power of courage and compassion, of choosing to help even when it would be easier to look away. And in Shoshone, Idaho, where the desert wind still blows across the sagebrush, and the mountains stand eternal on the horizon, people still remember the cowboy who saved a girl's life and then spent 50 years proving that love could triumph over even the darkest circumstances. Their story became part of the fabric of the town, a testament to the idea that one act of bravery, one moment of choosing good over evil, can ripple out through time and change countless lives. The house where Ryder and Rose raised their children still stands, converted now into a museum that tells the story of frontier life in Idaho. Visitors walk through rooms where Rose cooked and cleaned and loved, where Ryder held his children and dreamed of the future. They see the porch where the couple sat for thousands of evenings, watching sunsets and building a life together word by word, day by day. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the light slants golden across the desert and the air is filled with the scent of sage, people swear they can feel the presence of two souls who loved deeply and well, whose story reminds us all that from the darkest moments can come the brightest light, and that love, once kindled, burns eternal.